The air in St. Jude's was thick and heavy, tasting of wilting lilies and old, damp stone. It was a suffocating scent, the kind that clings to the back of your throat and fills your lungs until you feel like you're drowning in sorrow. I sat in the front pew, my black dress stiff and unfamiliar against my skin, the wool scratching at my knees. The hard oak pressed into my spine, a rigid, unyielding reality in a world that had suddenly turned to liquid. Beside me, my mother, Eleanor, was a statue of perfect grief. Not a single silver blonde hair was out of place. Her back was ramrod straight, her gloved hands clasped tightly around a lace handkerchief in her lap. She hadn't shed a tear, not one that I had seen. Her sorrow was a fortress, impenetrable and silent. The organ music vibrated through the floorboards, a low, mournful hum that seemed to shake the very marrow in my bones. Sunlight, thin and pale as watered-down milk, streamed through the stained glass windows, casting fractured rainbows of saints and angels across the stone floor. They danced over the polished mahogany of my father's casket. Robert's casket. The thought was a physical blow, a punch to the gut that stole my breath. It didn't feel real. He was supposed to be at home, in his worn leather armchair, the scent of his pipe tobacco and old books clinging to the air around him. He was supposed to be there to argue with me about politics, to help me with my taxes, to give me that quiet, reassuring squeeze on the shoulder that always made everything feel all right. Instead, he was in that box. And the world was not all right. It was tilted on its axis, spinning wildly out of control. My Uncle David sat on my other side, a stark, rigid presence. He smelled faintly of expensive cologne and something sharp, like ambition. He patted my hand, his own hand cool and dry, the gesture feeling more like a business transaction than a comforting touch. He was a good man, Clara, he murmured, his voice a low rumble that was barely audible over the priest's droning eulogy. A great man. I just nodded, my throat too tight to form words. I focused on the details around me, a desperate attempt to anchor myself. The tiny, almost invisible scuff on the toe of David's polished shoe. The whisper-soft rustle of a woman's dress in the pew behind us. The faint, metallic taste of my own tears as they finally welled up and slipped down my cheeks. My father, Robert, had been my world. He was the one who taught me how to ride a bike, the scraped knees and his patient, calloused hands wiping away the dirt and the tears. He was the one who sat up with me all night when I had a fever, the cool cloth on my forehead smelling of his familiar, clean scent. He was the man whose booming laughter could fill our entire house, a sound so rich and full it felt like the very architecture of my childhood. The service ended. The slow, somber procession out of the church was a blur of sympathetic murmurs and the soft, awkward pats of condolence on my back. The air outside was surprisingly cold for a spring day, a crisp wind that bit at my exposed skin and whipped a strand of hair across my face. It smelled of damp earth and the promise of rain. The reception was held at our family home, the sprawling Tudor where I grew up, a place that had always felt like the safest harbor in the world. Today, it felt like a museum of a life that was over. People milled about the living room, their voices a low, respectful buzz. They held plates of catered food that no one seemed to be eating. The house was filled with the scents of other people's perfumes and aftershaves, obscuring the familiar smell of home, of Dad. My mother moved through the crowd with a practiced, somber grace, accepting condolences with a slight, sad smile that never quite reached her piercing blue eyes. I felt adrift, a ghost in my own home. I escaped to my father's study, the one room that still felt like him. I closed the heavy oak door behind me, and the muted sounds of the reception faded away. Here, the air was different. It was him. The rich, sweet scent of cherry pipe tobacco, the leathery perfume of old books, the faint, clean smell of the lemon polish he used on his desk. The room was bathed in the soft, gray light of the overcast afternoon filtering through the large bay window that overlooked the garden. Dust motes danced in the beams of light. I ran my hand over the back of his armchair, the leather cool and worn smooth from decades of use. I could almost feel the impression of him still there. I sank into the chair, pulling my knees to my chest, and finally, I let myself break. The sobs came in great, heaving waves, raw and ragged, a sound torn from the deepest part of my soul. I cried for the man who had built my world, and for the terrifying, gaping hole he had left behind. A week later, the mourners were gone, and a new kind of quiet settled over the house. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, punctuated only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. My mother and I moved around each other like strangers, our grief a wall between us. The house felt too big, every empty room a reminder of our loss. Then came the appointment with Mr. Abernathy, my father's lawyer for over 30 years. His office was downtown, a place of dark wood, green leather, and the dusty smell of legal documents. It smelled of finality. Mr. Abernathy was a kind man, his face a roadmap of grandfatherly wrinkles. He looked at my mother and me over the top of his half-moon glasses, his expression one of deep sympathy. "Eleanor, Clara," he began, his voice soft. "Robert was very clear in his wishes. He took great care to make sure you were both provided for." He slid a thick sheaf of papers across the polished surface of his desk. The will. I stared at the crisp, white pages, my father's bold, familiar signature at the bottom of the last page. It was straightforward. The house, the stocks, the savings, everything was to be split evenly between my mother and me. His controlling interest in his construction company was to pass to me, a legacy he had been preparing me for since I was a little girl. It was exactly what we had expected. I felt a small, sad sense of relief. At least this part was simple. My mother nodded, her composure as flawless as ever. "Thank you, Howard. That's very good to know." But my Uncle David, who had insisted on being present, leaned forward in his chair. The leather creaked in protest. A strange, tight smile played on his lips. "It's a generous will, Howard. Very generous. But there might be a small complication." Mr. Abernathy raised an eyebrow. "A complication, David? Robert's wishes are ironclad." "Are they?" David's eyes, a paler, colder blue than my father's had been, flickered towards me for a split second. "The family trust, the one established by my grandfather, has certain stipulations. Pertaining to bloodline. To direct descendants." A cold knot began to form in the pit of my stomach. I didn't understand. What was he talking about? "Uncle David, what do you mean?" He ignored me, his gaze fixed on the lawyer. "I believe there is a legitimate reason to question whether Clara is, in fact, a direct descendant of Robert Miller." The room went completely, utterly silent. The only sound was the frantic, panic thumping of my own heart against my ribs. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I looked at my mother. Her face, for the first time since the funeral, had lost its serene mask. It was a ghastly, chalky white. Her hands were trembling in her lap. "David, that is a monstrous accusation," Mr. Abernathy said, his voice sharp with disapproval. "Is it?" David's voice was smooth as silk, but there was a venomous undertone to it. "I'm not making an accusation. I'm simply requesting, as a concerned family member and a beneficiary of the broader family trust, that we confirm the lineage. A simple DNA test. To make sure everything is, as you said, ironclad." I felt dizzy, nauseous. I turned to my mother, my voice a strangled whisper. "Mom? What is he talking about? This is insane." My mother wouldn't look at me. She stared at a fixed point on the wall behind Mr. Abernathy's head, her jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles twitching in her cheek. Her silence was the most terrifying sound I had ever heard. It was a confession. In that cold, silent office, with the smell of old paper and my uncle's cruel ambition filling the air, my world, which had already cracked, began to shatter into a million pieces. The man who raised me, the man whose blood I thought I carried, might not be my father. And the home I was grieving in might not be my home at all. The days that followed were a waking nightmare, lived in a fog of disbelief and a numbing, icy dread. My mother refused to speak about it. Whenever I tried to approach her, her face would shut down, becoming a smooth, blank mask. "It's nonsense, Clara," she would say, her voice brittle as autumn leaves. "Your uncle is a greedy, bitter man. Don't listen to him. But she still wouldn't meet my eyes. She spent her days in the garden, ruthlessly pulling weeds with a frantic energy, her hands caked in dirt, as if she could tear the ugliness out of our lives by the root. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. The silence was thick with unspoken words, with the weight of a secret I couldn't even comprehend. Every photograph on the mantelpiece felt like a lie. There I was, a gap-toothed 7-year-old on my father's shoulders, his face split in a wide grin. Was that grin a lie? There we were, a family on vacation at the beach, my father holding my hand as we jumped over waves. Was that man a stranger? My entire past felt like it was being erased, rewritten in a language I didn't understand. Uncle David, true to his word, filed a formal legal challenge to the will. Mr. Abernathy called, his voice heavy with regret. The court, he explained, had agreed to David's request. A paternity test was no longer a suggestion, it was a court order. The legal document arrived by courier, the crispness of the envelope feeling obscene in my trembling hands. The sterile, black and white text made it real. Clara Miller is hereby ordered to submit to a genetic sample collection. The day of the test was cold and gray, the sky the color of slate. The clinic was an anonymous building of glass and steel, the interior smelling sharply of antiseptic and floor polish. It was a place devoid of comfort, all hard surfaces and fluorescent lights that hummed with a low, incessant buzz. My mother came with me, but she felt miles away. She sat in the waiting room, her hands clasped in her lap, staring at the scuffed linoleum floor. She looked small and frail, a stranger wearing my mother's clothes. A nurse with a professionally detached smile called my name. Her voice echoed slightly in the sterile hallway. The room was small and white, dominated by a padded chair that looked like a throne of judgment. The nurse's hands were brisk and efficient as she swabbed the inside of my cheek with a long cotton applicator. The sensation was rough and unpleasant, an invasion. It was over in less than a minute. A tiny piece of me, my DNA, my very essence, was sealed in a plastic tube, labeled with a barcode. My identity had been reduced to a number. The waiting was the worst part. 7 to 10 business days, the nurse had said. A lifetime. Every ring of the phone made my heart leap into my throat. Every car that drove down our street made me jump. I barely ate. I couldn't sleep. I would lie in bed at night, staring up at the dark ceiling, the ticking of the clock in the hall sounding like a bomb counting down. I felt suspended in a terrible limbo, no longer the person I thought I was, but not yet sure who I would become. I was just a question mark. During that week, I tried to talk to my mother again. I found her in the living room one evening, staring into the empty fireplace. The room was dark, save for a single lamp that cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. The air was cool and still. "Mom," I began, my voice soft, hesitant. "We have to talk about this. Please. I don't understand." She didn't turn around. Her reflection in the dark glass of the fireplace screen was pale and ghostly. "There is nothing to understand, Clara. Your father is Robert. He raised you. He loved you. That is all that matters. But is he my biological father?" The words felt like stones in my mouth, heavy and jagged. David wouldn't do this, he wouldn't go this far, unless he was sure. "Mom, you have to tell me the truth." She finally turned to face me, and in the dim light, I could see the glistening tracks of tears on her cheeks. It was the first time I had seen her cry since Dad died. Her voice, when she spoke, was a raw, broken whisper. "The truth? The truth is a messy, complicated thing, Clara. It can destroy everything it touches." "The lies are already destroying everything," I shot back, the frustration and fear finally boiling over into anger. "This secret, whatever it is tearing us apart. It's letting David tear Dad's memory apart. Don't you see that?" "You think I don't see?" she cried, her voice cracking. "I have lived with this every single day for 30 years. Every time Robert looked at you with that fierce, proud love in his eyes, I lived with it. I did it to protect you. To protect this family." "Protect me from what?" I begged, stepping closer to her. What is so terrible that you had to lie to me my entire life? Who am I? She just shook her head, wrapping her arms around herself as if a cold wind had just blown through the room. Please, Clara. Let it be. Let's just wait for the test. Maybe David is wrong. Maybe it will all be fine. But I could hear the desperation in her voice, the flimsy hope of a woman who knew the truth was a tidal wave about to crash down on all of us. I walked away from her that night feeling more alone than I ever had in my life. The woman who was supposed to be my closest confidant was a stranger hiding behind a wall of secrets. The results arrived on a Tuesday morning. It was raining, a slow, miserable drizzle that streaked down the window panes like tears. I saw the courier's van pull up from the kitchen window, the official-looking logo on its side making my stomach clench. I met the driver at the door, my hand shaking as I signed for the large, stiff envelope. It felt impossibly heavy, as if it contained the weight of my entire life. I took it to the study, to my father's chair. It seemed like the only place I could face this. The room was cool and smelled of old paper and rain. I sat there for a long time, just holding the envelope, my thumb tracing the embossed seal of the laboratory. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. Finally, with a deep, shuddering breath, I tore it open. The paper inside was thick and clinical. It was covered in scientific jargon, and charts and percentages that meant nothing to me. But I didn't need to understand the science. My eyes scanned the page, searching for the conclusion, for the words that would either put my world back together or shatter it for good. And then I saw it. A single, devastating sentence at the bottom of the page, under the heading Conclusion. The alleged father, Robert Miller, is excluded as the biological father of the child, Clara Miller. Excluded. The word was so cold, so final. A sterile, scientific term for a gut-wrenching betrayal. I read the sentence again. And again. The black letters seemed to float off the page, rearranging themselves into a cruel joke. But it wasn't a joke. It was the truth. The man whose name I carried, the man whose face I saw reflected in my own every time I looked in the mirror, the man whose love had been the foundation of my life, was not my father. A strange sound filled the room, a low, guttural noise. It took me a moment to realize it was coming from me. It wasn't a cry, not yet. It was the sound of a reality breaking. The letter slipped from my fingers and fluttered to the floor. The room began to spin. The scent of my father's pipe tobacco, which had always been a comfort, now felt like a suffocating lie. I leaned forward, my head in my hands, the polished wood of the desk cool against my forehead. The world I knew had ended. In its place was a vast, terrifying emptiness. Who was I? If I wasn't Clara Miller, daughter of Robert Miller, then who in God's name was I? I don't know how long I sat there, lost in the silent, screaming chaos of my own mind. Eventually, I heard the soft creak of the study door opening. My mother stood in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes wide with a fear that mirrored my own. She saw the letter on the floor, and then her gaze lifted to my face. In my expression, she saw her answer. The fortress of her composure finally crumbled. "Clara," she whispered, her voice choked with a grief that had nothing to do with my father's death, and everything to do with this. I stood up, my body feeling heavy and disconnected, like it belonged to someone else. "Who is he?" I asked, my voice flat and dead, devoid of all emotion. It was the only question that mattered. Who is my father? The confrontation that followed was the storm that had been brewing for 30 years. It broke not with thunder and lightning, but with a low, agonizing confession in the suffocating quiet of the study. The rain beat a relentless rhythm against the window panes, a mournful soundtrack to the complete unraveling of my life. My mother, Eleanor, sank into the visitor's chair opposite the desk, her body seeming to fold in on itself. She looked ancient, the years of her secret carving deep lines into her face. "His name is Leo," she said, her voice so soft I had to strain to hear it over the storm outside. Leo Sullivan. The name meant nothing to me. It was a random collection of sounds, a name for a ghost. And? I prompted, my voice hard. I stood over her, my arms crossed, a prosecutor in my own family's courtroom. I felt a cold, hard rage building inside me, a shield against the pain that was threatening to drown me. She flinched at my tone. We met, it was a long time ago, Clara. Before I was even engaged to Robert. I was young, just out of college. I was working a summer job as a waitress at a resort up in the Catskills to save money for my master's degree. I could barely picture it. My mother, the polished, perfect society wife, working as a waitress. It was like a scene from a movie about someone else's life. She described the place in a low, trembling voice, the smell of pine needles after a rainstorm, the sound of a live band playing jazz in the evenings, the feel of the humid summer air on her skin. She painted a picture of a young woman I had never known, a woman full of dreams and a recklessness she had long since buried. Leo was a musician there, she continued, her eyes distant, lost in the memory. He played the piano. He was electric. Not handsome in the way Robert was, not polished. He was raw and passionate, and when he played, it felt like he was telling you all the secrets of the universe. We had a summer romance. One of those intense, all-consuming things that you know can't last, which only makes it more beautiful. She told me how it ended. The summer was over, and she was heading back to the city to start her life, the life she had always planned. Leo wanted her to stay, to travel with him and his band, to live a life on the road. It was a life she couldn't imagine, a life that terrified her. So she left. A few weeks later, she reconnected with Robert Miller, a handsome, stable, kind man from a good family whom her parents adored. He was the safe harbor after the storm of Leo. And a few weeks after that, she whispered, her gaze dropping to her hands, I found out I was pregnant. The air in the room grew thick, heavy. I could feel the blood pounding in my ears. And you didn't know whose it was? A single tear finally escaped and traced a path through her makeup. Oh, I knew, Clara. I knew. The timing, it was impossible for it to be Robert's. But I was so scared. I was in love with Robert, with the life we could have. He was a good man. I knew he would be a wonderful father. And Leo. Leo was a dream, a beautiful, impossible dream. He wasn't the kind of man you built a life with. So she made a choice. She never told Robert. She never told Leo. She accepted Robert's proposal and let him believe the child was his. She buried the secret so deep she almost convinced herself it wasn't real. You let him raise another man's child, I said, the words tasting like poison. You let him love me, thinking I was his daughter. You lied to him every single day of your marriage. It wasn't a lie, she cried, her voice rising in a desperate plea. He was your father. He was the one who was there for every scraped knee, every nightmare, every graduation. He was the one who taught you to be the woman you are. Blood doesn't make a father, Clara. Love does. Don't you dare use his love to justify your lies. I screamed, the rage finally breaking free. His love was real. Yours was built on a foundation of deceit. And what about this other man? Leo? Does he even know I exist? She shook her head, sobbing openly now. No. I never told him. I couldn't. It would have ruined everything. It's ruined now. I gestured wildly around the room, at the books, the desk, the pictures. All of this. This home, this life, Dad's memory. It's all being dragged through the mud because of you. David is going to take everything, and it's your fault. The silence that followed my outburst was more violent than the shouting. We just stared at each other, mother and daughter, two strangers separated by a chasm of 30 years of lies. The love I had for her was tangled up with a sense of betrayal so profound it made me feel physically ill. The next days were filled with the cold mechanics of the lawsuit. We met with Mr. Abernathy again. The atmosphere in his office was thick with a funereal gloom. He explained the legal ramifications. David's claim had merit. The family trust, established by my grandfather, was explicit, assets were to be passed down to blood relatives only. While the personal will leaving me the house and savings might be debatable, my claim to the construction company, the most valuable asset, was now on incredibly thin ice. "We can fight it," Mr. Abernathy said, his tone lacking conviction. "We can argue that Robert acted as your father in every conceivable way. In the eyes of the law, that can sometimes carry weight. But David's case, based on the DNA, is strong." The legal battle began in earnest. It was a slow, grinding process that stripped away every last shred of our family's privacy. There were depositions, endless meetings with lawyers, and mountains of paperwork. I had to sit in a sterile conference room while David's lawyer, a man with a shark smile and predatory eyes, asked me invasive questions about my childhood, about my relationship with Robert, trying to poke holes in the fabric of my life. My Uncle David was relentless. He was a constant presence, his smug satisfaction a palpable force. I saw him at a preliminary hearing, and the look he gave me was not one of familial concern, but of triumph. He saw me as an impostor, a fraud who had stolen his brother's legacy. Perhaps, in his own twisted way, he believed he was defending his brother's honor, but all I saw was greed and a cruel desire to punish my mother, and me along with her. My life became a blur of legal strategy and emotional turmoil. I stopped going to work. Friends would call, but I'd let the calls go to voicemail. What could I say? How could I explain the bizarre, sordid soap opera my life had become? I felt completely unmoored, adrift without an anchor. The name on my driver's license, Clara Miller, felt like a costume I was wearing. It no longer fit. One night, unable to sleep, I found myself in the study again, the letter with the DNA results still lying on the desk where I'd left it. I picked it up, the words just as stark and brutal as the first time I'd read them. And next to it, I saw a piece of paper where my mother, in her elegant, looping script, had written the name she had confessed to me. Leo Sullivan. I went to the computer, the glow of the screen pushing back the shadows in the room. My fingers trembled as I typed the name into the search bar. My heart hammered against my ribs. What was I hoping to find? A ghost? A monster? A father? The search results were a jumble at first. There were many Leo Sullivans in the world. But then, I narrowed the search, adding musician and piano. And then, I saw it. A website for a small bar in Austin, Texas, called The Midnight Tune. It listed the house band, Leo Sullivan and the Drifters. There was a photo, grainy and poorly lit. A man with a weathered face, laugh lines around his eyes, and a thick head of dark hair, flecked with gray. He was sitting at a piano, his fingers on the keys, a look of intense concentration on his face. I stared at the image, my breath caught in my throat. I searched for a resemblance, for some piece of myself in this stranger's face. Maybe the shape of the eyes? The set of the jaw? I couldn't be sure. But looking at him, a sudden, powerful urge rose up in me. It was more than just curiosity. It was a desperate need for answers, for a piece of the truth that wasn't tainted by my mother's lies. The court could decide who got the money and the house, but only I could decide who I was. I looked around the study, at the life that was no longer mine. The smell of Robert's pipe tobacco seemed to be fading, replaced by the sterile scent of legal documents. I booked a flight to Austin for the next morning. I didn't know what I would say to him. I didn't know if he would turn me away. But I knew I had to go. I had to look into the eyes of my biological father and try to find some piece of myself that made sense in a world that had become utter chaos. The airplane descended through a thick blanket of clouds, and suddenly, the sprawling, sun-baked landscape of Texas appeared below. The heat hit me the moment I stepped out of the air-conditioned airport, a heavy, humid wave that felt like a physical presence. It was a world away from the cool, damp spring of home. The air smelled different, too, a mix of jet fuel, hot asphalt, and something vaguely floral and dusty. I felt a strange sense of dislocation, as if I had stepped onto a different planet. I was 1,000 miles away from the cold courtrooms and the suffocating silence of my mother's house, but the knot of anxiety in my stomach was a constant, unwelcome companion. I checked into a nondescript hotel near the city center. The room was sterile and smelled of industrial-strength cleaner. I dropped my single bag on the floor and stared at my reflection in the mirror above the dresser. The woman looking back at me was a stranger. Her eyes were shadowed with exhaustion, her face pale. I still looked like me, but the identity behind the face felt fractured, incomplete. Was any part of me the daughter of Robert Miller? Or was I entirely the child of a piano player I'd never met? That night, I took a taxi to the Midnight Tune. It was on a side street, away from the main drag of noisy bars and honky-tonks. A simple neon sign, a blue musical note, glowed above the door. The sound of music spilled out onto the sidewalk, a soulful, bluesy piano melody that was both melancholic and beautiful. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I stood outside for a full 10 minutes, the warm night air thick around me, trying to gather the courage to go inside. This was insane. What was I doing here? What did I expect to happen? Finally, I pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The bar was dark and intimate, the air thick with the smell of stale beer, whiskey, and cigarette smoke. A long wooden bar ran along one wall, and small, candlelit tables were scattered across the floor. On a small stage at the far end of the room, illuminated by a single, warm spotlight, a man was sitting at an old, upright piano. It was him. Leo Sullivan. He looked older than in the photo, the gray in his dark hair more pronounced. But the intensity was the same. He wasn't playing for the small, scattered audience, he was playing for himself. His eyes were closed, his head tilted back slightly, his fingers flying across the keys with a fluid, practiced grace. The music he was playing was a living thing, full of longing and a deep, world-weary sadness that seemed to seep into the very woodwork of the bar. It was the most honest sound I had ever heard. I found an empty table in a dark corner, my body moving on autopilot. I ordered a drink I didn't want, my hands trembling as I wrapped them around the cold, sweating glass. I just watched him. I watched the way his brow furrowed in concentration, the way his shoulders moved with the rhythm of the music. I was studying a ghost, a myth, the man who was half of my biological equation. And as I watched him, a strange and unexpected feeling began to surface through the fear and anger, a profound sense of connection. The way he held his hands, the shape of his knuckles, they were just like mine. I had always thought I'd inherited them from Robert, but I hadn't. They were from him. This stranger. He played for another hour. When the set was over, he gave a small, almost shy nod to the smattering of applause and headed toward the bar. This was it. My chance. My legs felt like lead as I stood up and walked towards him. The sound of my own footsteps was deafening in my ears. Leo Sullivan? I asked, my voice coming out as a reedy whisper. He turned, a bottle of beer in his hand. Up close, his face was a roadmap of a life lived. His eyes were a startlingly clear shade of green, and they were kind. That's me, he said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. Can I help you? All the speeches I had rehearsed in my head evaporated. The words jammed in my throat. I just stood there, speechless, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. He must have seen the turmoil in my face, because his expression softened from casual curiosity to genuine concern. Hey, are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost. Something like that, I managed to choke out. My name is Clara. Clara Miller. I think you knew my mother. Eleanor. Eleanor Thompson. I used her maiden name, the name she would have had that summer in the Catskills. His reaction was immediate and profound. It was like watching a light go out behind his eyes, replaced by a shadow of a memory from a lifetime ago. He stared at me, his beer forgotten in his hand. He took in my face, my eyes, my hair. It was as if he was seeing me for the first time, and also seeing a reflection of someone he once knew. Eleanor, he said, the name a soft, dusty thing on his tongue. My God. It's been 30 years. How is she? She's okay, I said, the lie feeling flimsy. I'm here because she and we just found something out. something she kept from both of us. My voice trembled, and I couldn't stop it. I was born in April of the year after you two knew each other. I just took a DNA test. And the man who raised me, he isn't my biological father. The entire bar seemed to fade away. The music, the clinking of glasses, the low murmur of conversations, it all receded into a distant hum. There was only the space between me and this man, crackling with the weight of 3 decades of silence. He didn't speak. He just stared at me, his green eyes searching my face, the color draining from his own. He slowly lowered himself onto a nearby bar stool, his movements stiff, as if he had aged 20 years in 20 seconds. "You're telling me," he started, his voice rough with disbelief. "You're my daughter?" I could only nod, a fresh wave of tears blurring my vision. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure shock. He looked from me, to the floor, to the ceiling, as if the answer to this impossible revelation was written somewhere in the room. He was silent for what felt like an eternity. I held my breath, my entire being coiled in anticipation of his reaction. Would he be angry? Would he reject me? Would he tell me to leave? Then, he looked back at me, and his eyes were glistening. A single tear escaped and traced a path through the weathered lines on his cheek. "All these years," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't quite name. It was a mix of awe and regret and a deep, soul-shaking sorrow. "I have a daughter." He didn't turn me away. He didn't get angry. He opened a door I never even knew existed. We talked for hours, until the bar was empty and the chairs were being stacked on the tables. He asked me about my life, about Robert, about my childhood. I told him everything, about Robert's kindness, his patience, the construction company, the devastating diagnosis, his death, and the ugly, bitter lawsuit that had brought me here. He listened without judgment, his green eyes full of a sad empathy. He told me about his life, too. A life on the road, 2 failed marriages, no other children. A life rich with music but empty of the kind of roots I had always taken for granted. He told me about my mother, about the beautiful, vibrant girl he had fallen in love with during one magical summer. He wasn't bitter that she had left him. He was sad, but he understood. "She chose a better life for you, Clara," he said, his voice gentle. "I was a mess back then. I couldn't have given you a home like the one Robert did. He sounds like he was a good man. A real father." Hearing him say that, hearing this stranger, my biological father, honor the man who raised me, was a balm on my raw, wounded soul. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a flicker of something other than anger and confusion. It was a fragile, tentative sense of peace. The final court date was set for the following week. I knew I had to go back. I had to see this through to the end. I told Leo the first had to leave. "Will you come back?" he asked, the question hanging in the air between us, full of unspoken hope. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "My life it's a mess." "Well," he said, giving me a small, sad smile. "You know where to find me. It took you 30 years, but you found me. I'm not going anywhere." The flight back home was different. The anxiety was still there, but it was joined by something new. A sense of clarity. The court case wasn't about the money anymore. It wasn't about the house or the company. It was about honor. It was about defending the memory of Robert Miller, the only father I had ever truly known. I wasn't fighting for the inheritance of a blood relative. I was fighting for the legacy of my dad. When I walked into the courtroom for the final hearing, I felt a new strength inside me. The room was just as cold and imposing as before, the air thick with tension. My mother was there, looking terrified. David was there, looking confident, his shark-like lawyer at his side. But this time, I wasn't just Clara Miller, the disinherited daughter. I was also Clara Sullivan, a woman who had crossed the country to find a missing piece of herself. I knew who I was, not because of a name or a bloodline, but because of the love of 2 different men. And I was ready to fight.